Welcome, House Churches. So tonight we are going to be talking about the Gospel of Mark. Mark is obviously the author of the book of Mark. It's mentioned in Acts that he was kind of around during this time. In fact, in Gethsemane, in the story at the end of Mark, it mentions a bystander watching the events unfold during Jesus' arrest, and many people believe that this is Mark. But in Acts, they talk about Mark as well, and they believe that the disciples met a lot at his family's house, and so he was told about all the events of Jesus' life from Peter. So a lot of these things are kind of in the perspective of Peter. And so we get that, and we see that, and we know that during this time frame that Mark was written was when Mark was with Peter in Rome. So we know that Mark is written to the Romans. We know that he was in Rome at that time with Peter, like I said, but we also can tell by the way that he wrote that this was directed towards the Romans. In fact, whenever he's forced to use Aramaic words, and you can kind of tell it's forced, like he doesn't want to use them, but whenever he has to use them to get the context across, he defines all of them, so that way the reader knows what it means, as well as he doesn't talk about fulfilled prophecy. He kind of keeps that out. He kind of refrains from talking about that because, again, his readers were the Romans, and that's who he was kind of addressing Jesus' life to, and that's kind of who he was trying to reach in this, was showing the Romans who Jesus was and his love for the Romans, even though obviously the Romans were a part of the people that convicted and crucified Christ. When reading the book of Mark, you get this sense of from one thing to the next. It's like you almost can't take a breath because everything's happening so quickly. In fact, Mark uses immediately 39 times. Mark is a fast-paced writer, and you read it fast-paced, and it's from one event to the next event to the next event. And so as you're reading it, you're like, all right, and we're going, and we're going, and we're going. And Mark does that to show you that Jesus was looking towards the cross and the resurrection. It shows you that Jesus' mindset was the end game, the end goal. And that was his death and resurrection for humanity. And also it's to show that Jesus wasn't on earth for a long time. He had all these things to get done. And we know that obviously through reading the Gospels that we read all that Jesus did each and every day, and the things the big major things. There was also things that we don't read about in the Gospel that he continued to do. But yet we see that Mark is saying he lived on earth for a short time. And in this short time, he had a lot of things to get done. And so these are as much things as he could get done. And again, immediately he went and did this. Immediately he went and did that. And so it's shown that Jesus was busy and he was here for a purpose. And his purpose was to serve others, and obviously the mindset and the end goal of the cross and the resurrection. And so that is kind of who wrote Mark, obviously Mark, and the time frame / common theme that we get throughout Mark is this mindset of Jesus and how much he did and when he did it, right? Big idea is that Mark reveals Jesus as God's servant. And there's one verse in particular that shows this in Mark. If you have your Bibles, you can open up to Mark chapter 10, verse 45, and it says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I mean, think about that. Think about just that one verse, how it affects our lives as Christians, how it affects our lives going forward, and showing that Mark is showing Christ as a servant, that Jesus came to serve. And not only that, but even by all the miracles and things that Jesus does throughout the book of Mark, Mark is trying to show the power and compassion of the Son of God. He's shown that not only did Jesus change people's lives spiritually, right? Like what was going to happen here with the death and resurrection. But Mark was also trying to show how Jesus affected people's lives physically in the circumstances they lived in, by healing blind people, by raising people from the dead, by doing all these things that Jesus did. Not only did he help them spiritually, but he also helped them physically in their needs. He helped them in the circumstances that they lived in. And that's two things really that Mark tries to show throughout his gospel. That Jesus is a servant, and that not only was he a servant, but he wanted to show his compassion and love to people to change and affect their lives, not only spiritually, but also physically and in the circumstances that they lived in. And so a kind of an outline that you can follow, and we're going to get to two that I really want you to look at and break down in one of the questions I have for you. But the outline is, first in chapter 1, verse 1 through 13, you have the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Mark starts off right off the bat. This is when Jesus started his ministry. This is what's happening. This is how it's going down. Again, Mark is showing he has lots of things to do in a short time to do them. And then we see in chapter 1, verse 14 through chapter 6, verse 29 is Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Now, it's the first time, again, he'll come back later, Mark will, and talk about it, and we'll get to that. And then we have in chapter 6, verse 30 through chapter 9, verse 29 is his strategic withdrawals from Galilee. The moments where he goes to other places and ministers there and preaches there and does some miracles there as well. So that's kind of the in-between leading to the final ministry in Galilee, which is chapter 9, verse 30 through 50. And then you get into Jesus' ministry in Judea and Perea in chapter 10. And then it gets to the end of Mark with the passion of Jesus, obviously chapters 11 through 15, and the resurrection of Jesus, chapter 16. And as you look at this outline of Mark and look at, what he's doing, it's again the theme that continues with Mark, that he was here for a short time and he had a lot to do, but his end goal and his mindset was on the cross, the death, and the resurrection. And that's what Mark really wanted to get across to the Romans. And he was trying to show the Romans that, this is who Jesus is. Jesus loved others. He not only helped people and obviously served people spiritually, but again, through all these different ministry options in this outline, it's to show the Romans Jesus also served people physically. And then you get to the last 6 to 7 chapters of Mark, and it's showing the end, the death and the resurrection. But there's two miracles that I kind of want to pause on, and I want you to pause on because I want you to think about these two. Mark talks about 21 miracles throughout the whole book. 21 miracles. And so I want you to think about, in 21 miracles, there are 2 that are original to Mark. So why are they original to Mark? What is Mark trying to show us about the redemptive narrative? What is Mark trying to show us about who Jesus was? And the first miracle that's original to Mark is Mark chapter 7, verse 31 through 37. And it says, "Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Epaphras, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So that's the first one. The second miracle that is only in Mark is Mark 8:22 through 26. And it says, "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, 'Do not even enter the village.'" So again, those are two miracles out of the 21 that Mark talks about that are original to the book of Mark. And so I ask you guys, as a house church, discuss that. Why do you think that these two miracles are only in Mark? And why do you think it's so important that Mark would put them in his gospel? Again, he's trying to speak and reach the Romans. He's trying to show the Romans this redemptive narrative of Jesus' life. Why do you think he shows them? So how can we apply the book of Mark to our lives? And I want us to think, we've been studying the redemptive narrative for a long time now. The redemptive narrative is something that again, we've studied from Genesis now to all the way to Mark. And so, have you been living a lifestyle with the cross on your mind? Have you been living a lifestyle with the redemptive narrative on your mind? That yes, as you go from one thing to the next and you live a busy life and a busy schedule, but during that schedule, has the cross been at the forefront of your mind? Have you been thinking, how can I serve others in this time? How can I love others in this time and in this schedule that I'm in? Because as the book of Mark is showing us, as another key book in the redemptive narrative that God gave us, that Jesus is living a life that is serving others not only spiritually, but also physically and in their circumstances. And he's living in a mindset with the cross on his mind. Are we doing the same thing? And so I want you to think about that. How have we been living with the redemptive narrative on our mind? And also, like the book of Mark is talking, have we been serving others? Not only meeting their spiritual need, but also meeting their physical need and meeting them in their circumstances. Because as Mark talks, that is what he's trying to display through this book in the redemptive narrative.